They laughed. Loud, careless, like I was some forgotten relic who didn't belong in their world anymore. I stood there, every heartbeat scraping against 25 years of silence. The man leading the laughter was once the soldier I'd pulled from a burning cockpit, the same man who later signed the report that destroyed my name. He called me a failed pilot. I called him nothing. Because when betrayal comes from the life you saved, words don't matter, only memory does. And my name is Kaelin Rhodes. The heat in Arizona didn't feel like sunlight, it felt like memory. The air shimmered over the tarmac at Davis-Monthan. As I stepped out of the car, the smell of jet fuel wrapping around me, like an old, unwanted ghost. 25 years had passed since I last stood here, but the ground still looked the same. The same cracks, the same dust, the same silence that once swallowed everything I was. I never planned to return. After I left, I built a quiet life in Colorado Springs, teaching aviation theory. Keeping my head low, keeping my name lower, then came a letter from the Department of Defense, an invitation to join a new program called SkyReach as a tactical advisor. I almost declined until I read one line that froze me mid-breath. No one understands classical combat patterns better than Phoenix 1. That name. The one they erased from every file after 999. The first morning at SkyReach, they called for a welcome briefing. The room was all stainless steel and fluorescent glare, young officers lined up with caffeine and arrogance. I introduced myself in a single line. A snicker came from the backlight, dismissive. "You a pilot?" A few others laughed. The sound was sharp, metallic, and familiar. I didn't answer. I simply tapped my pen 3 times on the table, a reflex I hadn't used in decades. Most ignored it. Only one man in the corner, older, quiet with gray at his temples, lifted his head, eyes narrowing, as if he'd seen a ghost slip through the door. When the meeting ended, I walked past the command office. On the door, a brass plaque caught the light. Colonel Trent Halverson. The name hit like turbulence in my chest. The man whose report had ended my career was now leading the program I'd been called to advise. The sun outside was burning down when I stepped onto the runway again. Wind pushed dry sand against my boots. Somewhere in the distance, a faint warning tone echoed in my mind, the one I'd lived with since the day everything went down. It still hadn't stopped. I started by reading what they handed me, the SkyReach dossiers, and the case studies Trent had signed off on. One section stopped my breath, the 1999 training loss summary. The line that mattered called me out by name, accusing me of failing to answer a distress call, abandoning the unit unfit for command. Blood hammered behind my eyes. The memory rose up, how I had turned back into the heat and pulled a man from a burning cockpit, the rasp of his breath against my shoulder, the weight of him on my arms. Burke, a quiet engineer with hands like someone who had spent his life on racks and consoles, slid a cup of coffee across the table and lowered his voice. He warned me not to let Trent see me studying that file. He admitted Trent had been the one to submit the final report, and that the black box data had conveniently been listed as lost. I copied the official file onto my laptop and compared it with an old archive I had kept. Signatures were wrong, serial numbers mismatched, timestamps had been altered, someone had rewritten the record. That night, Eli texted that Trent had recommended him for the SkyReach test team. My chest tightened so hard I could hardly breathe. Eli did not know what had been done to my life, who had signed the report that burned me out of a career. It became clear Trent wanted more than silence about the past. He wanted power over the future. I shut the screen, watched my reflection in the glass. The worn Phoenix 1 pin lay on the desk, its nick showing. If someone intended to bury the truth, they did not know how deep I had already dug. The next morning, I stood before the trainees in the simulation bay screens, flickering like distant weather systems. Eyes measured me with thin skepticism. At the back, a single woman kept her shoulders squared, nerves masked by a steady jaw. When I taught a maneuver for evading radar, instead of relying solely on algorithmic paths, someone called it old school. I told them algorithms kept you alive. Instincts got you home. The room quieted. The woman in the back smiled in a way that felt like recognition. After class, she approached with a stack of printouts. She had found inconsistencies in archived flight logs, a checksum anomaly that suggested someone had edited files from inside the system. She said she had been poking around out of curiosity about 99. Her name was Mora. She handed me a thumb drive and asked me to trust her. On my way back, I spotted Trent leaving the tech bay with two senior officers. Their conversation halted as I passed. The old cold thrill hit my spine, an echo of the corridor that led to the meeting where my career was ended. Later, a message appeared on my phone from an unknown number telling me to stop digging, that some things were meant to stay buried. No signature, no threat, but the meaning was plain. Whoever sent it wanted me to know they were watching. Mora was a mirror of a younger me. Trent was the shadow who had once rewritten a life. I lifted the phoenix pin between my fingers and felt the metal bite. If he wanted a fight, he would find that I did not come back to stand alone. By the second week, the desert felt like it was pressing its palms against the base walls. The temperature had climbed to a blistering 106, and even the air inside the briefing hall felt heavy, thick with recycled breath and tension. Every seat was taken for the Skyreach simulation review. Mora led the mock operation flawlessly, her precision cutting through the holographic clouds, until Trent interrupted. He rose with that same smug composure that always preceded something cruel. "Stop the sim," he said. "Let's do it the real way." His eyes slid toward me like a blade. We all know who failed to keep formation 25 years ago. The room went still. Every sound folded into silence. I recognized what this was not a review, but a performance, a public attempt to humiliate me. I kept my voice even, each word measured. "If you're testing discipline, Colonel Cowardice isn't the place to start." The low murmurs spread through the room like an aftershock. Trent forced a laugh, brushing it off, but his jaw twitched. I saw what he didn't want anyone else to see, fear. The kind that belongs only to a man who once owed his life to someone he betrayed. When the briefing ended, I walked out without looking back. Behind the closing doors, the faint laughter died out. The hallway air felt metallic in my lungs. Mora caught up with me, fire burning in her eyes. "Why did you let him say that without answering him?" I told her the truth. Victory doesn't come from who shouts the loudest. She looked doubtful, too young to understand that silence can sometimes be louder than rage. That night, an email appeared in my inbox. No name, no subject, only 4 words, for Phoenix 1 Confidential. I hesitated, then opened the attachment. Static. A warning alarm. My own voice from 1999, sharp through the interference. "Trent, stay with me. Pull up. Pull up." Then the harsh crack of metal, followed by a strained voice, his. She turned back. "She's coming for me." The recording cut off. A single line sat beneath it. Kept this for decades. The world should hear it. The file name read, Strickland Odd, 1999. Wave. My breath caught. Strickland, my former commander. The man who vanished right after the crash. If he was still alive, justice hadn't died completely. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. A quick search in the personnel records confirmed it. Strickland was alive, living in Tucson Veterans Home, just 2 hours south. I looked down at the Phoenix 1 insignia resting on my desk, then started packing. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't running from the past. I was driving straight into it. The Tucson Veterans Home smelled of antiseptic and pine. The walls were quiet except for the distant shuffle of nurses' shoes and the faint hum of an oxygen machine. Strickland sat by a window overlooking the desert, the sun carving gold lines across his worn face. His shoulders were narrow under a faded jacket, but his posture was still that of a soldier. Without turning, he spoke. "I knew you'd come back, Phoenix." It had been decades since anyone called me that. I asked the question I had carried across those miles. "Did you keep the real black box?" He nodded once. "They wanted it destroyed. I gave them a copy. Did Trent know?" He smirked, tired but sharp. "No. He only knew I was forced into retirement for breaking protocol. For protecting your name would have meant exposing theirs. Tell me, Kaelin, whose honor do you think they were preserving?" My nails dug into the armrest until I felt the skin break. Strickland opened a drawer and took out an old external drive labeled in faded marker, Phoenix 1, original flight record. "I thought you'd never come," he said, "but you're still the only one who deserves to hold it." My fingers shook as I took it. Inside was the unedited cockpit record proof that I hadn't abandoned anyone. Proof that Trent had lost control and that I'd turned back to save him. He told me that defending me had cost him his career. They called it a disciplinary retirement. Justice can be buried, he said, but it still breathes. It just waits for someone to dig deep enough. As I stood to leave, he looked up again, voice thin but urgent. Be careful, Kaelin. Trent isn't the only one who wants silence. His superior back then, he's higher now, a senior advisor. The name hit me like cold water. The same man who'd signed the letter inviting me back to Skyreach. When I reached my car, the phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Stop digging, Kaelin. You'll lose more than your wings this time. I locked the screen, stared out across the blood-red desert. The horizon burned like an open wound. I already lost my wings, I whispered. Let's see what I can fly with now. The morning sun hit Davis Monthan like a spotlight washing the runway in white heat. Inside the main hall, the Skyreach Strategic Review was already underway. Every ranking officer and Defense Department advisor had taken their seats. I could feel it in my bones, this was the endgame. The briefing room pulsed with tension and recycled air. Fluorescent light gleamed off the steel table, as Trent took the stage with a swagger he must have practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, Skyreach will define the next era of aerial combat. The simulation flickered across the screen, then failed the same error pattern from 25 years ago. He smirked. Funny the system failed again. Maybe our consultant can weigh in someone with plenty of experience in failure. The laughter that followed was thin but sharp. Every chuckle was a blade finding its mark. I rose my voice steady. Colonel Halverson, the system failed because someone built it on a lie. The room stilled. I reached into my bag and set the old Phoenix 1 insignia on the table. 25 years ago, you forged a report. You said I left you behind. But the truth is... The door burst open before I could finish. A deep gravel voice carried from the entrance. She went back for you. Heads turned. Strickland stood in the doorway, silver medals glinting on his uniform cane in one hand, his back straight as ever. He stopped beside me and saluted. Phoenix 1, ma'am. Every sound died. The young officers who had once laughed were suddenly on their feet, saluting without thought. Strickland placed the original hard drive on the table and queued up the recording. Static filled the room, followed by my voice, younger strained but clear. This is Phoenix 1, returning to retrieve downed pilot. Repeat, returning to retrieve, negative. Phoenix 1 abort. He's still breathing. I'm going back. Then the crash. The silence and the screen went dark again. Trent Rowe's voice cracking. That's edited. Mora's voice cut through from the control booth. Then maybe you can explain this one, sir. Another clip began to play, Trent's voice cold and unmistakable. If you speak Kaelin, your son's career ends here. The silence that followed was absolute. A defense advisor leaned forward, his voice barely audible. Is that your voice? Colonel Halverson. Trent didn't answer. Sweat rolled down his neck as his eyes dropped to the floor. I picked up the Phoenix insignia, the metal warm in my hand. You laughed because you forgot. But some of us remember everything. On the screen, Mora launched the final simulation, 3 fighter jets rising in formation, their paths blazing into the shape of a phoenix. I turned to Strickland. He smiled faintly. Welcome back, ma'am. 2 days after the briefing, the base at Davis Monthan went into lockdown. No one in or out without clearance. The hangars were silent, the airfield stripped of noise. Inside the administration wing, the Special Investigation Board assembled a tribunal of brass and gray suits, pretending not to have known what had been simmering under their watch for decades. I sat in the back row, far from the microphones and cameras, where I could see everything and say nothing. The truth was already loud enough. Strickland took the stand-first cane propped against the chair beside him, his voice firm despite the years. He handed over the original flight record, the unaltered cockpit log, and the old recording Mora had restored. When they played both at once, the sound filled the room, like a wound reopening my voice, calling to turn back the warning alarms, the proof that Trent had falsified every line of that report. He'd destroyed the black box data, buried the evidence, and used my silence to rise in rank. Across the room, I saw him shrink a little with every second of playback. Then came Mora. She stood straight, chin lifted, her youth somehow making her defiance burn brighter. She played the recording of Trent's threat, the one he'd made in that office, using my son as leverage. The officers on the panel stared at each other, shifting uncomfortably. There was no spin left. A senior defense advisor, the same man who had sent the letter inviting me back, tried to interrupt. Colonel Trent acted independently. The department had no knowledge. Strickland's voice cut him clean. Then why does your signature appear on the clearance file? The room broke open in chaos, shouts, papers slapping on the table, people standing. The panel chair pounded his gavel, but no one was listening anymore. The truth was loose, and it was louder than order. Through the noise, I caught sight of Eli standing at the back of the hall, in uniform still as stone. Our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us moved. When the session ended, he walked toward me, the noise fading around us. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice shook, not with anger, but disbelief. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "Because you deserve to fly for yourself, not under my shadow." He nodded, jaw tight, trying to keep it together. His eyes dropped to the Phoenix 1 insignia pinned to my jacket. Under the fluorescent light, it shone again after 25 years of dust and silence. By that evening, word had spread across every military network. The recordings leaked, the headlines blared, Skyreach fraud exposed. Trent Halverson stripped of command. Department officials under review. They offered me a reinstatement, an honorary return to Skyreach. I declined. Let them build something new. They needed younger wings, not an old one burned to remind them of the fire. As I stepped outside, the desert sun dipped behind the hangars, leaving the air quiet and golden. Justice doesn't roar, I thought. It hums quietly, at 30,000 feet, steady, unseen, and unstoppable. Morning settled softly over Colorado Springs, the kind that feels like forgiveness. The peaks of Pikes Peak glowed faintly, gold clouds rolling slow and quiet along their ridges. I was home again, no uniform, no base, no rank, just me and the open air. The silence was different here. It didn't demand anything. It simply existed. On the table sat a photo I hadn't seen whole in decades. The old Phoenix Squadron 1999's. The corner that had been torn during the inquiry was now patched with clear tape, as if time itself had tried to mend it. Maura had sent it along with a small note in her careful handwriting, "We fly because you once did." I traced the faces in the picture, the young, eager versions of ourselves, unaware of what the years would take. I smiled, feeling both the ache and the warmth of it. Out beyond the window, I could hear the faint roar of engines cutting through the mountain air. Stepping out onto the porch, I looked up. 3 fighter jets streaked across the Colorado sky, in formation rising and turning until they shaped the familiar wings of a phoenix. The sunlight caught their bodies, flashing silver and flame against the blue. Inside the light hit the Phoenix 1 insignia on the table, setting it aglow like it was alive again. The reflection danced across the walls, flickering softly, like the heartbeat of something that had refused to die. They laughed because they forgot, I whispered, but I smile because I remember. The jets disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a white arc that faded slowly against the morning sky. I watched until the sound was gone, replaced only by the hum of wind through the pines. The sun moved higher, its rays spilling through the glass, lighting the insignia, until it shone like a flame rekindled. The phoenix had risen once more, not for vengeance, not for glory, but as a reminder. Honor, when it's true, never falls. It only waits for the right wind to lift it again.